The fact that they were seeing the humanity of those people marks them out as very different from the Nazi Party program.
Especially when you think that the students had grown up under fascism, the program of indoctrination was astonishing. So to not only live in that time, but to have grown up as a target of that kind of propaganda and indoctrination, and still be able to see that it was not correct, is, I think, part of what inspires people about them.
This is Life and Faith, a podcast where we put aside talk of culture war or all the stuff we seem to disagree about and talk about the human longings and experiences we all share that make up the mystery of life and faith. Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. For a long time, I've been captivated, disturbed, and really challenged by the story of Sophie and Hans Scholl, brother and sister who were young university students executed by the Nazis in February of 1943. I wonder if you know about this story. They were both central figures in the group called the White Rose. They were a group of students and some lecturers who saw it as their duty to risk their lives in order to oppose the tyranny of Nazism. They became convinced that they had to take action against their own government and its crimes. And they began a campaign writing and disseminating thousands of pamphlets condemning the regime and calling on their fellow Germans to resist their government with passive resistance.
Every word that comes out of Hitler's mouth is a lie. When he says peace, he means war. When he blasphemously invokes the name of the Almighty, he means the power of the evil one, of the fallen angel, of Satan. His mouth is the stinking maw of hell, and his power is at its very essence corrupt. We will not keep silent. We are your guilty conscience. The White Rose will not let you alone.
As you can imagine, this was a highly risky thing to be involved in. The Nazis were at the peak of their powers, and opposition like this was simply not tolerated. Hans and Sophie Scholl were both students at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Mid-morning on the 18th of February 1943, they entered the main building of the university and began distributing two of the pamphlets in the atrium at the entrance to the main university building. After Sophie, perhaps recklessly, pushed a pile of these pamphlets off a balustrade into the atrium below, a caretaker saw and apprehended the two, and they were taken away by the Gestapo for interrogation. Just 4 days later, after effectively a show trial, they were executed by guillotine, along with their friend Christoph Probst, a 23-year-old father of three. Now, these were just the first of a series of executions and imprisonments of members of the White Rose. The way Sophie Scholl and her brother conducted themselves in the interrogation and at the trial was remarkable, as was the sentiments of their colleagues who wrote about why they did what they did and how they viewed their pending doom. This is our focus today, and with us is Dr. Alexandra Lloyd, a fellow in German at St Edmund Hall at the University of Oxford. And she's written a book about the White Rose, and particularly the pamphlets of the White Rose. The book is Defying Hitler, and she has translated these pamphlets into English with her students, those students being a similar age to the original authors, which brings a really interesting angle to this story. It's a story that seems to me to be timeless in its challenge and application. Alexandra Lloyd joined me from Oxford. I began our conversation by asking her what first drew her to this gripping, tragic tale.
In my research as a Germanist, I've worked a lot on the history and memory of the National Socialist period and World War II. So the White Rose resistance group was a story that I knew, a story that I'd heard about. There's a film version that came out in the early 2000s that I'd gone to see in the cinema when I was a student in Germany. So I was very familiar with it, but I'd never actually read the resistance pamphlets that this group had written. So I came back to that much later when I was a university tutor, when I was teaching translation with students, and kind of rediscovered this story around about the 75th anniversary of the White Rose.
I've seen that film. It's a very compelling film, isn't it? Tell me about what it was like to then go in and read the pamphlets. Did that change your perception of it, or just sort of deepen it, or what was that like?
I think it's a story that's very well known, certainly in Germany, less so outside. But I think it's often a story that's known without necessarily any engagement with those pamphlets, with those texts. So it's a really compelling history. I found that reading the pamphlets raised a lot of questions about this group and what they were doing and what they were arguing and how they were arguing it. And just really enriched the whole thing. And I spend a lot of time talking about the White Rose, and I always encourage people to go and read those pamphlets, because it's not only what the students did, it's also a kind of amazing document from 1942 or 1943 that kind of sets out what this group of people thought was wrong with fascist Germany and their proposals, if you like, for how things could change.
Yes, and they're an interesting lot, aren't they? They're very well read, they're engaging with each other and sharing ideas and drawing on history and philosophy and theology. They're alive. It would have been an interesting dinner party, that group, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they read voraciously. And again, as a university teacher, that's a very exciting thing. You know, when one spends most of one's life talking with students and sharing ideas and trying to help them develop their own ideas about the world and discussing literature and films and texts and philosophy, it's kind of inspiring to see that all those things had an effect for this group of people.
That exactly, because it's something that when you're an academic, sometimes academics are accused of sort of being in their ivory towers. This group were kind of an academic bent, but it drove them to serious action. That's a very interesting kind of angle on this story, isn't it?
I think what's really striking about them is that they read, but then they discuss. And that discussion element of how they go about starting to view the world is really what's valuable in leading to the point where they take action. So it's not just that they read, it's that they then discuss that reading with other people, with each other, with other students, but also with sort of older, what are often called mentor figures in the history of the White Rose. So other academics, writers, creatives, philosophers, translators, people who also are uncomfortable with or suspicious of or dissidents within fascism. So talking to those people who also have much more life experience just by virtue of being considerably older than the White Rose students, you know, who are in their early 20s, is that reading and discussion that is the process through which they learn about the world and they start to see that other worlds are possible. You know, Nazi fascism was a system that was really trying to close things down, to narrow everyone's worldview, to accept that there was one worldview and not diversity of belief or values or life. And so this process of reading and discussion is what allows the students, especially, to see that the world is more complicated than that.
Yes, and I mean, they definitely didn't think it was just limiting yourself to one view. They thought that view was thoroughly pernicious and damaging and needed to be defeated. It really drove them to action. Well, they were idealistic, weren't they? Were they naive? Or they've been criticised as being such, haven't they?
For me, this is one of the reasons why it's so exciting to work on this material alongside university students. Because as I increase in age, I get closer to the age that Professor Kurt Huber was. I'm getting further away from the age of my students. And so, you know, you do start to see the world differently. And there's an energy and a zeal, I think, that comes with youth. And I think that's something that we see very strongly in the White Rose pamphlets and that we see in the actions of the student members of the White Rose. The question as to how naive were they, I think, is really interesting. So I'm often asked this question, you know, Hans and Sophie Scholl take copies of the resistance pamphlets to the central building of their university. and they distribute them in broad daylight, kind of 11 o'clock in the morning. And that's so audacious and so outrageous that they would do that, and so dangerous, frankly. And of course, it is dangerous. They are caught. But I think of my students and the way that they interact with the spaces of their university here in Oxford. They are proprietorial. They have a sense of entitlement. These are their spaces, and they own them, and they live in them, and they work in them. And I think then it becomes easier to understand how it was possible for Hans and Sophie Scholl to undertake this daring action. It's their space, it's their university. So I think it's not necessarily so much naivety. I think it is idealism. I think it is youthful idealism, the idea that you can change the world, you can do something. Yeah. But also it's a sense, I think, of confidence in themselves, in their space.
And it was, even if there was an element of naivety, it wasn't like they were naive about the potential consequences. They was unbelievably courageous in the circumstances. Let's talk about Hans and Sophie Scholl. They're brother and sister. Yep. They're brought up in a household shaped by Christian values, liberal kind of values, I guess. Their father was a pacifist and an anti-fascist, and he got in a bit of trouble himself for that. They were both, though, like she was in the women's equivalent of the Hitler Youth, right? And he was as well. What was it that brought them to the point where they thought, actually, this National Socialist state has to be brought down, having been probably part of it initially?
Yeah, this is the million-dollar question. How is it possible that Hans and Sophie Scholl and the whole group of the White Rose, especially the student members, how is it possible that they see what apparently no one else can? Why can they see that fascism is a terrible system that persecutes people, that robs them of their dignity and their lives? With Hans and Sophie Scholl, it's so interesting that they are ostensibly very enthusiastic members of the Hitler Youth, and then they fall away. And I think part of that process is, again, one of enlightenment. It's that they encounter other people with opposing views. To grow up in a house where your father is an anti-fascist under fascism, your youthful rebellion is you join the fascist Hitler Youth. Of course, there's a psychological reality to that. That I'm sure many people can recognize. You rebel against your father by doing the opposite. So I think it's partly that they grow older. I think that they start to see for themselves in interactions with others that this system is not just and fair. And other members of the group see that also and come to see that also, but they do it from a different perspective. Hans and Sophie Scholl are really the two that are obviously the most actively involved in Nazism as young people, as children. So it's a process of discernment that happens gradually. I think it's very difficult to pinpoint one transformative moment. I know people like to because it's a better story, but it is, I think, a combination of things that come together, that grow together, so that by the time they're at university, in their early 20s, they've really turned their back on this now.
Very often people can forget the unfolding nature of this drama, right? Lots of people didn't know that it was heading in this direction, even though there were some people who, very few actually, but some who saw it pretty clearly early on. But this was an unfolding story that we have the benefit of hindsight to see. This idea of freedom is really central to all the members of the White Rose. Sophie Scholl famously wrote freedom on the indictment that she received as she was being interrogated. Hans Scholl's last words, evidently, were "Long live freedom." Tell me about the White Rose concept of freedom and why it was so personally important to them.
The word freedom occurs multiple times across all of the 6 printed pamphlets. And it really is like a kind of rallying cry. It's also a word that some of the students of the White Rose graffitied on buildings in Munich and on the university. So it was a real slogan for them. Yeah. I think it's really a freedom from Nazism, from the yoke of Nazism. So it's the sense that Nazism is something that is controlling and restrictive. And what they want is freedom from that, freedom from Nazism, which has led them into this terrible war. I think it's also a kind of, from a Christian point of view, a sort of freedom for. So it's your freedom to act in a moral or a just way. It's the fact that you individually, as a self-determining person, have free will and you have a choice to act in this way or to act in that way. So I think we can understand it in both of those ways. It's freedom from Nazism, but it's also the freedom to take responsibility and act. And that's something that they really, again and again, call on the readers of their pamphlets to do, to mount resistance, to open their eyes and to take action.
Even in its earliest embryonic form, this movement was dependent on deceiving the German people. Even then, it was rotten to the very core and could only save itself through ceaseless deception. Even Hitler himself writes in an early edition of his book, a book which, despite having been written in the most appalling German that I have ever read, has been elevated to biblical status by this nation of poets and philosophers. He said, "You would not believe the extent to which you must deceive a people in order to govern it." If at first, this cancerous tumour on the German people had not yet made itself all too conspicuous, this was only because there were still forces for good working effectively enough to hold it back. Yet, as it became bigger and bigger and finally came to power with one last base act of corruption, the tumour, so to speak, ruptured, contaminating the whole body. Now we are approaching the end. Now everything depends on finding one another again, on one person enlightening the next, always reflecting and never resting until every last person is convinced of the dire necessity of fighting against this system. If such a wave of uproar travels through the country, if there is something in the air, if many people get involved, then this system can be shaken off with one final tremendous effort. An end with terror is still better than terror without end.
I wonder if, as someone who's become quite close to the story, whether you have ever felt the cold terror, as I have as I've thought about this story, of putting myself in this exact same situation and wondering, could I have done this?
I think it's part of what makes the story so compelling, and it's part of why we keep telling it and why I think we should keep telling it, and trying to understand what it was that drove them to do this and to try and understand what it was that allowed them to do it. I think for myself, when I've been working with students on this story, we've always come to a point where we've discussed precisely this question, because it's very easy, especially as a UK Germanist. I have no German family, no German background. So I read this story with, as it were, historical and personal distance. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy when we hear talk about the history of Nazi Germany, we tend to talk about it in a very distanced way. And then it's always really important to then turn that back in on ourselves, to interrogate our own lives, our own professional lives, our university, and to try and think of the small ways that we can allow ourselves to be inspired by this story.
Yes.
But the White Rose didn't have the privilege of living in a society where they could express their views. The result of them expressing their views in this way, of saying things that were essentially true, the consequence of that was that they were executed.
You're listening to Life and Faith, and I'm speaking with Alexandra Lloyd, author of Defying Hitler, focusing on the activities of the resistance movement, the White Rose, in Nazi Germany. Now, one of the striking things about the White Rose was their clear-sightedness when it came to the treatment of Jewish people. This is one of the things they spoke really clearly about and saw as a key part of resistance. So I wanted to ask Alexandra Lloyd about this. Here she is again.
This is a hard question to answer in a sense, because one of the problems with the history of the White Rose is when you have a resistance activity, it's not necessarily terribly well documented, right? Because to document it is incredibly dangerous. So the pamphlets are the manifesto. And while there are many published excerpts from letters and diaries by the White Rose, there is not a clear statement of motivation necessarily that says, okay, this is a scenario and this is how we must act. I think that their very clear action is kind of bystander action. They themselves, for the most part, are not the sort of people who the Nazi regime is going to actively target. Once they become political dissidents, yes. But up until that point, no, not really. Hans and Sophie Scholl are, in a sense, the perfect young Germans, as far as the Nazi regime is concerned. I think there is a real sense that they feel motivated to stand up for others who are being actively persecuted. So it is this kind of bystander action. And it's interesting, I've discussed with students a lot the pamphlet where the White Rose essentially say, we don't want to talk about the Jewish question. So they, as it were, they kind of assume that their reader isn't going to engage with them on that point. You know, we're not going to discuss it. We're not going to try and argue with you as to whether this is correct or incorrect. We just want you to acknowledge the suffering. And I think that in itself is really interesting. They're not leading from a position of trying to argue intellectually with their reader as to whether this program by the Nazis of anti-Semitic persecution is right, wrong, correct, incorrect, justifiable, unjustifiable. They sort of park that idea and appeal to their reader's to their moral sense, to their sense of justice, and they appeal to them as Christians, as they say again and again and again in these pamphlets. But they're appealing to their sort of moral sense that this suffering and persecution is wrong. Exactly.
Right. The humanity of the people they're talking about here. And the fact that they were seeing the humanity of those people marks them out as very different from the Nazi party program.
Especially when you think that the students had grown up under fascism. The program of indoctrination was astonishing.
Yeah.
So to not only live in that time, but to have grown up as a target of that kind of propaganda and indoctrination and still be able to see that it was not correct is, I think, part of what makes them so remarkable and what inspires people about them.
Now, when you want to get these pamphlets translated into English, you're using your students for this, and this was a real project you took on. Tell us a little bit about that and why you thought this would be a good idea.
I teach a lot of translation at Oxford, so I teach literature and film and also translation mostly from German into English. And I was reading about the White Rose and I had a translation class. And so I gave my students a couple of short excerpts from these pamphlets and said, what do you think? Let's have a go at translating them. And in the process of that class, I realized that it would be really exciting to have a translation of these pamphlets that had been done by students in a university context around about the same age as the original authors, the student authors. So that was part of it was, okay, what happens if these translations are not being done by, it's usually a middle-aged historian who translates them and then they go at the end of their book. That's great. That has tremendous value. But I thought, wow, what would it look like if students translated students? And then the other part of the project was that we translated them collaboratively. So we had 2 or 3 students who took responsibility for each of the pamphlets, but then every pamphlet translation was discussed by the larger group. And I think, again, the White Rose pamphlets were written as a collaboration. And so the idea that you would translate them also collaboratively, it felt like we might be able to just capture something of those original processes in our translation practice. But it was really an experiment to begin with, but it bore wonderful fruit.
Complicity with the governance of an irresponsible clique of rulers driven by their darkest urges, and complicity without resistance, nothing is more unworthy of a civilised people. Is it not so that in the present day every honourable German is ashamed of their government? And who among us can foresee the extent of the infamy that will be on us, and on our children, when the veil is one day lifted from our eyes and the most horrific crimes beyond all measure, come to light?
So it's tapping into the spirit too of the original students by putting them alongside, that same kind of person. I bet it had a big impact on your students.
It really did. I mean, I ran the translation project. It started in 2018 with the pamphlets, and then the following year, a new group of students came in and we worked on excerpts from the letters and diaries of the White Rose. And then we did that subsequently and moved into more creative translation. So the students produced artistic and literary responses to the pamphlets themselves. We did this all through the pandemic. We had translation seminars online. We had them when we were allowed back in the room in our masks, and then all the way out the other side. And it was an exciting intellectual process to engage with this material as a group of people trying to understand the past, trying to engage with the past, and also trying, I think the students said this a lot, trying to do justice to these voices from the past, these incredible young people.
Well, I bet it's an experience your students won't easily forget, for sure. Now, tell me about the White Rose's concept of passive resistance and sabotage and why they thought that was the best way to tackle this enormous problem.
The White Rose, I think, recognised the tremendous challenges, practical challenges of mounting resistance. And I think they also probably recognised what an immense undertaking this was. So they call on Germans again and again in the pamphlets to open their eyes, to recognise what is going on around them, the injustices around them. And I think one of the things that probably made resistance in general so difficult was our willingness as human beings to go with the flow and the immense difficulty that most people have with putting their heads above the parapet. So to try and argue with people, to try and convince people to do that was an extraordinary undertaking. It's interesting, they don't necessarily say that they have an instruction manual. It's not a kind of bullet point list of, right, okay, so now do this. But they do eventually, this is in the third pamphlet, they tell their readers, we do not have a vast range of means at our disposal. We have only one, passive resistance. And then they say that the meaning and purpose of passive resistance is to bring down Nazism. That's what we're trying to do. And then they give some examples of things that people could do. They could sabotage arms factories, intellectual groups. One of the things they suggest is not giving money to the Red Cross because it will just be repurposed by the government for the war effort. So they are suggesting some practical steps which fall under, I think, what we could also call non-violent resistance. So this is take actions which are going to interrupt the war effort, but that are not violent actions against other human beings.
Ahead of their time in a lot of ways. I'm interested in the hopes they had for post-war Europe. They thought religion was going to be a really important part of that. And then I have this here, there's this really interesting quote that they pick up on that says, true anarchy is the generative element of religion. There's this sense that once you've gotten to this point of terror and the breakdown of decency and morality and the cruelty that they've witnessed, that people are going to be longing for something substantial. They see it as a sort of a religious quest. That was a pretty important part of their thinking.
I think it's interesting. You mentioned earlier other resistance groups. And there were other groups. The Kreisau Circle, for example, was really interested in not mounting resistance under fascism, but planning for what would happen after fascism.
Yeah.
And the White Rose are absolutely concerned with the future of Germany, almost prophetically so. They talk about collective guilt and the guilt that Germany will experience after the war, which of course it does. And the idea of collective guilt is central to a lot of post-war literature and culture and politics. So they're very future oriented. And I think what's striking about the pamphlets is how many ideas from different sources and from different philosophies and worlds they draw together. I think they don't have a single proposal or plan, but they have a single sense of what is morally right and what people will need. And what people do need is an end to the war in order to move forward and to live freely. And I think that's also, in a sense, a result of the fact that the group itself is, if not socially diverse, at least diverse in terms of their Christian backgrounds. So it's a very interdenominational group. You have Russian Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Protestant, Lutheran. Everything always resists a single view of the world.
Now, there's some pretty confronting religious language in some of this writing. In pamphlet 4, Hitler is described as the messenger of the Antichrist. What's behind the use of this kind of language? Are they meaning this literally? What's happening there?
So one of my colleagues, Helena Tomko, has written really wonderfully on this. So the 4th pamphlet was really very heavily influenced by a man called Theodor Hecker, who was a translator and philosopher, and who met the White Rose students. They went to readings that he gave of his works. So pamphlet 4 has been shown to be really heavily influenced by Hecker. And so Hecker's writing on the Antichrist essentially makes it into the pamphlet. So this is a kind of direct example of the influence of a particular person, their writings on this. I have to say that's one of the translations that I really love. They did such a beautiful job here. What always really strikes me, it's sort of remarkable how brazen it is, to call Hitler the Antichrist. I mean, Hans Scholl's father was imprisoned in the summer of 1942 for telling a joke about Hitler. And yet here is his son and his friends producing this pamphlet where they make a joke about Hitler in an earlier pamphlet. They make a joke at the expense of his political manifesto, Mein Kampf, and say that it's really written in this sort of terrible German. But here, to be so outrageously brazen, in addition to the philosophical context for that and the religious context, just the fact that you would say this so outrageously is remarkable.
They weren't leaving anyone in any doubt, were they? And as you say, in the environment they were in, it's a shocking thing. And putting themselves right in the centre of danger. They knew that were they to be caught, that there wasn't going to be like half measures directed towards them.
This is totally treasonous. You say this on pain of death.
Yeah. The story of these young people, and mostly the young people, aren't they, and their tragic end is one that really still, it's so captivating today, isn't it? Because there's such a almost romantically tragic story to this. I mean, it's so awful. It strikes me that they must have felt there was some sort of eternal significance in what they were doing for it to make sense for them to act in this way. Am I right in thinking that?
If we look at their last letters, those we have, I think what we see very
moving.
Yeah. And what we see very clearly is a sense that they are totally justified in what they've done, that they have done absolutely the right thing, and they are now going back to their maker. There is absolute confidence, I think, in having done God's will, even if they don't necessarily always articulate it precisely in those terms. That to me is the feeling that I always get, is that they absolutely know that their wills and the will of God have aligned in that moment, and that really is the summit of what they can do with their lives, that their sacrifice is worth it. And that's incredibly difficult for someone, I think, like Christoph Probst, who was 23 when he was executed and had 3 young children.
Yeah.
I think that there's something, of course, tremendously moving about that, but it's also remarkable to have that sense of resolve with that responsibility. So I think they see that what they do is right. And it is tremendously shocking. That the thing that has never stopped shocking me is the speed. The length of time is so short between arrest and execution. Hans and Sophie Scholl distribute their pamphlets on the Thursday morning, and by Monday evening, they and Christoph have been executed. It's just astonishing. I sort of sit on a Thursday thinking, gosh, this is remarkable that this happens so quickly. And then the fallout of that also, when parents aren't informed that their children are going to be executed, they find out about it later, that there are Gestapo officers overlooking the funeral because there's a sense that other members of the group might be able to be rounded up. Alexander Schmorell attempts to flee Munich, and then doesn't manage it and comes back and is arrested. The sequence of events in the immediate aftermath is incredibly dramatic and frenetic. And that isn't even the end. There are more White Rose trials. There are more executions that go on almost to the end of the regime.
Yeah. On top of all that, I read in your book about one of the wives of one of the men who were executed being sent a bill for the wear and tear on the guillotine. And I just thought everything about that captures the contrast of this story of the worst of humanity, the sort of calculated cruelty, and the best of it as well, which you see, I think, exemplified in these young people. It's a bit of a tricky question, I think, but it's hard to escape it, that the sort of legacy, but also the way in which this group still can speak to us today. I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
This is a fascinating question, especially for someone like me. I work a lot on cultural memory and how stories about the past are told in culture, in books and films and museums. The White Rose story and the telling of that story not even after 1945, even after their execution, is really complex and complicated by the fact that we have 40 years of German division in East and West. And what we've seen very recently is the use of the White Rose story in different contexts. I've written about the use of the inspiration that was drawn from the White Rose and from Sophie Scholl by anti-lockdown protesters during COVID. So this is a group that continues to to be a point of reference and a point of inspiration in all sorts of different ways, really across the political spectrum. I think for me personally, something that I wonder about is how far the White Rose story becomes instrumentalized and the extent to which someone like Sophie Scholl becomes an icon. She's a blank canvas that people can project things onto. She can be used by individuals and organizations to justify their actions. And this is why I always urge people to go back and read the pamphlets, because we can read these people's own voices. We can hear their voices. We can read their letters. We can read what they said and what they wrote. And we can read what they were calling on German people to do in the 1940s. And I think that is the best antidote to reducing their story to a dramatic heist or a terribly tragic tale about some good people that were murdered by the Nazis that risks obscuring all the other stories and all the other victims of German fascism.
That was Alexandra Lloyd. Let's finish today with an extract from the last letter written from prison on the day of his execution by Alexander Schmorl, one of the White Rose members, writing to his father and stepmother.
It seems it was to not be any other way. And in accordance with the will of God, I am to leave my earthly life today, to enter another, one which will never end and where we will all meet again. May this reunion be your solace and your hope. Sadly, this will be harder for you than for me, because I pass on in the knowledge that I have remained faithful to my deepest convictions and the truth. All of this allows me to face the imminent hour of my death with a clear conscience. Think of the millions of young people losing their lives out there on the battlefield. My fate is the same as theirs. In a few hours I will be in a better life, by my mother's side, and I will not forget you, and will ask God to grant you comfort and peace, and I'll be waiting for you. Above all, my parting message is this: do not forget God.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. Alexandra Lloyd's book is Defying Hitler, the White Rose Pamphlets. And to me, this story feels like it has much to say to us today about courage in the face of injustice, moral bravery when it costs you a lot. Thanks to Dr. Lloyd for speaking with us, and thanks to those who read for us extracts from the book. And if you know someone who might appreciate the story of the White Rose, then please send it on to them. We love it when people do that. Send them the link and they might also get interested in other episodes of the 500 episodes we have here at Life and Faith. Also, leave us a rating or review. That helps as well. Thanks for listening. Next time.
My choice for this Lent is nothing to do with chocolate or anything like that, but I've looked carefully into my own heart and see what I still don't like in my heart. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to give up judging and criticising and condemning people, and instead embracing their beauty, the sweetness that's there. Now that sounds like it's just a little shift. It's actually a gigantic struggle.